Hello golfers, Will here, Golf Psychologist. Today I'm going to be covering point number 3 of my 3 essentials to the golf swing. Let's get started. So if you haven't seen essential number 1 and number 2, definitely go back and look at that video, and then this can add to it. This can also be a standalone video because it's all about the grip and the wrist hinge and clearing up a lot of the confusion with all of those aspects. This is so huge and so important that I consider it an essential, because the way you put your hands on the club will determine the way that you hinge the club. Also, the setup is going to determine the way that you hinge the club. So we see a lot of talk about the one plane swing, getting the hands and the club shaft to line up to start the swing. Of course, that can work. I mean, there's some great players that play like that. But what they're doing is they're taking out the angle that's created with dropping the arm down from the shoulder, and that creates an angle between the forearms and the club shaft. So if you're going to set up in that way, which is how I set up and how I teach most people to do, is get comfortable with your setup where the arm is falling from the shoulder, and you create an angle there between the club shaft and the arms. Now, why is that important? Because I've already established somewhat of a wrist hinge by just setting up that way. So if I take my setup and I don't do anything with my hands, you can see that I've already got a pretty good angle there. It's not 90 degrees, but it's pretty strong. It's a pretty good angle. So there's less things I would have to move in order to do that. If you set up like this, you're not going through the swing with no wrist hinge. Those guys are still hinging their wrist. So in my opinion, it's better to set up with some angle so that you have less to hinge in the backswing. And so that's why most professional golfers set up like this, okay? Now, the wrists move 2 different directions in the golf swing. And instead of spending a bunch of time going into the grip, what I'll just say is that if you're a neutral or strong, that's probably where most people are, where you can see 1 or 2 or 3 knuckles on that lead hand. If you're super weak, like some professional golfers, that's totally fine too. You just got to know what you're getting with those different variations. It's not just one is right and one is wrong. One will create a cascading of other issues versus the other. If I set up with, I have more of a neutral to slightly strong grip, I've got 2 knuckles that I can see on the lead hand as I'm looking down. And because I've got an angle at address, I don't have to hinge as much of the club going this way. Now, the wrists do work in 2 different directions. They work this way and they work this way. And sometimes the question becomes, which one is right? Or are you supposed to do both? There's great players that only hinge this way because they are thinking, I've already got most of my upward wrist hinge done. So as I go into my swing, they're just moving the right wrist back in the golf swing. They're not moving any wrist hinge up. That's because of the way that they set up. Now, for me, I do a little bit of both, and I do them both at the same time. So here's how that looks. That right wrist is going back and up, almost in the same motion. Both are happening. I'm going a little back and loading that right wrist, but I'm also moving the club up just slightly. And that gets me into a really balanced position at the top. So when I take my address position, I start moving my hands in after my takeaway, and then essential number one is that the hands have to go in, and then I am hinging the club in this direction. So that does create a little bit of a cup in my left wrist. My left wrist ends up looking like this. This would be flat. This would be a slight cup in that left wrist. Why is there a cup? Because I haven't changed anything from address. I haven't flattened this out and then got to the top of my swing and then tried to hinge. I've kept it the exact same, let the hands travel in, and then let the club slightly turn up. And there is a slight cup in that left wrist. So then that begs the question, is it better to flatten the wrist, bow the wrist, okay? Or is it okay to have a little cup in that wrist at the top? Well, I'm gonna explain that. Now you see great players bow in that left wrist. Dustin Johnson, Morikawa, John Rahm. But these guys have been doing that their whole life. It's just a part of their swing. Bruce Koepka, same way. What the bow does for the swing that's good is that it basically closes the face and it allows you to just turn the body to get back to the ball. Weight shift, of course, is still involved, but they're really good. Those guys are really, really good at their transition move, at their athleticism with their legs, knees, ankles. All of those joints are just so dialed in that they can bow that wrist and it helps them. But in interviews, if you hear them, they're not saying that they're trying to bow their wrist. It just is happening as a result of the way they're moving their body and their hands in the swing. So if you see that and you go out and you're trying to bow that wrist, you're gonna hurt yourself. You're not going to be successful if you haven't been doing that your entire life. So don't try to bow the wrist. It's okay for the wrist to just move in a more natural way where you do have a little bit of a cup at the top of the swing. That was okay for Ben Hogan. It was okay for Bobby Jones. It's okay for even Adam Scott. He's got a very slight cup at the top of his wrist, at the top of his swing. And then of course that flattens out as you go down. If you have stored energy in that backswing by a pretty straight left arm, good swing path, and you've just slightly hinged the club up, you're in such a strong position here that as you start that transition, the club weight is going to go behind you and you're going to flatten that left wrist out before you get to the ball. So don't worry about it if it's slightly cupped. What you want is to feel very secure. You want to feel like you have total control of that club coming into the downswing. If it's moving around and you're doing different hand motions and wrist motions and changing all those angles, it can get really confusing and it's not going to help you. So I'll hit one for you. Kind of thinking about all of those factors that we just went through. Again, essential number one, my hands are going to work in. I'm going to get that depth. I'm going to allow the wrist to just more naturally hinge as a result of doing essential number one. And then on my downswing, I'm going to allow that essential number 2, the transition, to happen with a push, a weight shift, a lateral move toward the target. So I'll put all those 3 together for you and hit a shot. So not a lot of movement going on, not a lot of waffling around, and oh, I gotta bow the wrist, I gotta get it, you know, the right wrist turned. I'm trying to make it really simple for you by just saying, you put your hands on the club correctly and back to the grip again. It's okay to have a little bit of that right palm on the grip for security. You don't have to put it all in the fingers. You can have a little bit of that grip hitting the palm because that gives you that sense of control. If you just have it in the fingers too much, you're too wobbly, okay? So a little bit, you got a lot of palm on that lead hand. A little bit of palm on that trail wrist is not a bad idea. Give it a shot. I think it'll work for you, and good luck to you. If you need some help, go to my website, findyourpeakperformance.com. We'll see you next time.